on a second.
Okay, Bob, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Palisades Presbyterian Church. On behalf of the congregation here and the Palisades Free Public Library, I welcome you all to this evening's presentation by Dr. Klaus H. Presentation is a topic that involves us all. It's climate change risks, I want to make sure I get it right, and adaptation needs for the New York City metropolitan area. This is a subject that concerns us all because we live here and because climate change, climate chaos, I would say, impacts the whole world. Dr. Jacob will be introduced this evening by his longtime colleague at Lamont, Dr. Lynn Sykes, who has himself been involved in extensive research into plate tectonics, which has revolutionized the study of the Earth's crust, the evolution of climate, and the distribution of natural resources. Dr. Sykes has also been instrumental in the verification of underground nuclear testing to the end of seeking its total ban. A longtime resident of Palisades, Lynn became a member of the Lamont staff in 1965 after graduating from MIT, followed by a Ph.D. at Columbia. He's authored more than 135 scientific articles, including 35 on nuclear test verification. It is my honor tonight to introduce Dr. Lynn Sykes, who will in turn introduce tonight's speaker. Lynn?
Thank you. Klaus received his Ph.D. in Germany in geophysics and came to Lamont in 1968. He very quickly joined a group that drove across the country so he could see it all to just outside the Nevada test site. And at that time, the United States, as well as Russia, were testing very big underground atomic explosions. So he and colleagues set up instruments to try and see if aftershocks of a big explosion were happening that were generated by the large atomic explosion. It turned out it wasn't at the place where they monitored, as people from Nevada had previously claimed. So he has worked in the field of earthquake studies and also underground atomic explosions. And more recently, that is more than a decade, he has been working on climate change and the topic of tonight's paper. So, Klaus.
Thank you for the community of having me here, and thanks for introducing me, Lynn. Lynn was actually coming out to Nevada after the big explosion, and we had a good time crisscrossing Death Valley and all sorts of other places out in California, measuring small earthquakes with our mobile instruments. That's now a while ago. And next week is Climate Week. So you folks in Palisades are way ahead of the game. Congratulations for that. You may ask, how did the seismologists get involved in climate change? Well, both caused disasters. And for a while I was teaching actually disaster risk management down at Columbia. And that's how I got involved in this topic. Because people said, oh, you worry about all those earthquakes. We never have any here. but we have other things going on here. Why don't you worry about those? I said, no, okay, why not? So, that leads to the topic of today. And, next slide. I want to cover 3 parts here. Part 1 is I want to give sort of an overview of sea level rise on a 10,000 year scale. Then I want to introduce the concept of risk. And you will see later on why is that a consequence. And then I want to cover some generalities of climate change from cause to consequence. Then in part 2, we switch over to regional and local examples, how that manifests itself. I use Sandy in 2012 as an example of a storm surge, but it's very important to keep in mind that you never should look at coastal storm surges alone. You always have to combine it with what's going on with sea level rise, and we will come to that point later on. Then we quickly make a trip up to the Hudson Valley, and lo and behold, since I'm from Piermont, I use Piermont as an example. We quickly also will not just do coastal flooding events, but also look a little bit at other climate change extreme events like heavy precipitation, like Ida was in 2021. And then we can ask ourselves, so what do we do about it? And I wish I could say we would do something about it. We are still far from doing enough. There are short-term measures that one can take. Most of them are not sustainable for very long times. The long-term sustainable adaptation measures, first of all, what are they? And we will see once we understand what one could do, they're politically not very easy to sell. Next. So here's the 10,000 year view of sea level rise. Actually, it's 30,000 years from 20,000 years ago to present, and then the next 10,000 years into the future. And what we see here in a time that's called Pleistocene, by my colleagues up at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, some of them are geologists, from about 20,000 to 7,000 years, sea level rise was going up by more than 100 meters, more than 300 feet. That's higher than the highest point of the Palisades here. Why? Because glacial masses over North America and Scandinavia melted away. Why? I won't get into it. And that ice ended up in the ocean. So if you put more water in the ocean, it rises. Then, from 7,000 years back to present, sea level was amazingly constant. And now think about it, 7,000 years. That's about when what we call civilization, for better or worse, developed. So all our societal experience is practically this constant sea level rise. And that haunts us in the years to come. Because for the last 100 years plus, which is just here called today, we had somewhat of an energy need, and we satisfied that with fossil fuel burning. That had its consequences, and depending on how many petagrams, or you can also use that as gigatons of carbon dioxide or plus equivalent of carbon dioxide ends up in the atmosphere. You see, these are the forecasts for these different carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, how much sea level rise will or could rise. So it depends on our behavior, whether we have only 75 feet of sea level rise, or as much as 150. Good luck. And that's why we're talking about this stuff. That's pictures of Greenland and Antarctica today in terms of their ice cover. If we would put those 5,000 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere, Greenland ice would be gone, and Antarctica will just have a little remnant here. Next. Risk. Well, why are we talking about risk? Because both climate mitigation, meaning how we change our energy use and therefore wean ourselves from CO2 emissions or other greenhouse gas emissions, and adaptation, that's the consequences of what will happen in global warming, can be seen as forms of risk management. Why? Because risk, as the formula down there says, is the product of, well, I have a more general term here. Risk is simply the potential for future losses. And you can express that probabilistically, so many dollars on average per year you lose, either globally or locally or whatever your region of interest is. Or you can define it as how much is the loss for a given event, for Sandy, for instance, in New York City, or in Lamont, or New So risk then resides, or is this product, if we look a little bit more closer what these losses are, how they come about, it's the product of three factors. The hazards, which you may want to get from a flood zone map. It gives you the probability of a storm in a given area, 1% per year chance of storm, or the so-called 100-year storm. Is what FEMA uses. The assets where we have things constructed, our houses, our buildings, our industries, our commerce, and our infrastructure. And the last factor is vulnerability. So what is this? Well, depending on how we design a structure, it's either more or less vulnerable to a given hazard at a given location. So, how can we manage this risk that resides now in this overlap of those three factors? Next one. Well, we can put the assets into hazard zones, or we can move them out of hazard zones. That reduces the overlap. We even can reduce the hazard by not putting so much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Or locally, we can put barriers and dikes and levees so the flooding doesn't get to the assets. So, depending on how we use, we either reduce the assets that overlap with the hazards, Or we reduce the hazards and make that hazard circle smaller, and therefore the risk over that will be smaller. The vulnerability, however, can be regulated by engineering codes, building codes, structural and architectural design, and FEMA guidelines, and so on. So these are the ways in which we can manage this risk. I didn't particularly mention it, but it's very important. Land use and zoning. Where can I build where, what? Is very, very important tool. To what extent we are using it, that's a political decision. Next one. So now I want to talk a little about climate change in a more basic way, and do that from cause to consequence. We already said we put about 100 years of greenhouse gases from our fossil fuel use into the atmosphere. That causes global warming, first in the atmosphere immediately, and then with some delay, that heat gets also into the ocean. Now, when the ocean warms up, it expands, not from the ice that comes in, just from thermal expansion it gets bigger. So that's another contributor to sea level rise, just because the ocean gets warmer. That takes time before that heat, of course, gets transferred from the atmosphere in the ocean. And that's why it takes, sea level rise is always limping behind what's going on in the atmosphere. But there's a consequence from having a warmer ocean. Not just because it expands, but also it causes more evaporation of the water from the ocean. It's a little bit like turning on your gas flame under the water pot. It evaporates more and the water is warmer. But also, the warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture. So the atmosphere is very happy to take all that moisture from the warm oceans up. But when you have all that moisture in the atmosphere, and you send it from the lower latitudes into our latitudes, or to New Orleans, or you name where, and it hits a cold front, then that moisture just gets dumped, and it churns the atmosphere in terms of tropical storms, also known as hurricanes, if they're big enough here. It's interesting that only the strength of the hurricanes seems to be affected by global warming. Not so much the number of storms. With a little footnote, because as we will see later on, combined with sea level rise, even smaller storms can have the effect in the future as bigger storms have at current sea level. So even the smaller storms will cause in the future flooding, coastal flooding. And they are much more frequent than the big ones. So the total damaging storms, it increases, but the number of hurricanes per se doesn't really change, just their intensity. So instead of a hurricane category 2 or 3, we might get a 4 here, or God forbid a 5. I will also show some examples for more extreme precipitation. And then I have some things here in red that I sort of will mention in passing, but really don't spend much time on. I really mostly focus on flooding, both from coastal storm surges and from rainfall. But droughts and heat waves are, of course, another consequence, particularly in certain areas, for instance, the southwest of the United States. And they can cause wildfires if the droughts are going on. And before was a lot more rain, and then we have a drought, then all this green stuff that grew suddenly becomes fuel for the wildfires. And if afterwards a heavy rain comes, and the roots of those plants are destroyed, then you get mud flows. So it's the cycle between rain, wildfires, mud flows. Next. So why is our built environment so vulnerable? Because where we have built, many people want to be on the ocean front, on the waterfront, but also how we have built. And that applies to entire cities, to individual neighborhoods and buildings, but also very importantly to the infrastructure that we all rely on. From transportation, trains, highways, communication, electric grids, you name it. So we have built some of those things in flood zones, but when we have to plan for the future, we cannot just look at the current flood zones. We have to look forward. Where do the flood zones develop with sea level rise and heavier rains? So the past is not anymore a good predictor of the future. Then we have built a lot lately in wildfires. And while Palisades itself, for instance, doesn't have much flooding risk potential, I believe, wildfires, I would be a little bit worried here after a long drought. This community could very well be affected by it. So think about it, what shingles you have on your roof, and what bushes and trees you have close to your house, and what material you use for your house. Because you have, okay, the how, the vulnerable designs, I just reflected on some properties of buildings, but also we have entrances to subways and other things that we will discuss in a moment that make it vulnerable. We have inadequate drainage. Our sewer systems, particularly in the city, but also in other places here, in this county, don't have the capacity to take up this new extraordinary rainfall rates. So they overflow, and that's even made worse because we have had so many impermeable surface created that the rain just doesn't trickle into the ground. It wants to get into the sewer system, and that's overburdened already, and so you have a double whammy here. And then Lamont-Doherty in wildfire zones in the US, many buildings are built out of wood. Some people even have wood shingles. If we had brick buildings, it would be an entirely different story. Next one. So, now climate change. This is a time scale from the 1990s to 2030, so we're sitting around here today. And these are the emissions in gigatons of carbon dioxide and equivalent other greenhouse gases per year. So it's the rate in which we emit things. And look how that, even so in the 90s, we already knew about global warming and climate change. That's the global emissions, okay? That includes not just the US, Europe, China, India, Brazil, you name it. how that has been going up from 30 to almost double just in those 30 years or so. Then in Paris, 2015, people assembled and looked at those curves that I showed earlier with how many gigatons produced, what kind of sea level rise, and said, oops, we gotta do something about this. And so they set targets. The target was in terms of temperature, that the temperature in the atmosphere should stabilize at about 1.5 degrees higher than for industrial period, pre-industrial period. But then they looked at what this requires and said, 1 degree is a little bit too difficult, so they settled for 1.5 degrees. But what this means in terms of the emission rate per year, this is the path on which we should be. So we have to go back to pre-1990 levels down to about 25 or so by the year 2030, which is only 5 years from now, 6 years from now. Wow, looks like we had a little troubles. And then they pledged at subsequent meetings, like in Glasgow and other COPs, Conference of the Parties, what they could contribute, each country. And they made policies that translate into targets. And that's what they came up with so far. That's the gap between where we ought to be in 6 years, where we think we might be if we are not electing certain people that cancel the Paris Agreement. Wow, that means we're going up one of those higher blue curves, not those blue curves in that 30,000 year framework. That ain't so good, isn't it? Next. And that's what it looks like in sea level rise. So you set the sea level at the year 2000 at 0, and then by the year 2100, the end of this century, depending on which emissions path, how quickly we are weaning ourselves from using fossil fuels, we are either up here or we are here, which is something closer to the 1.5 degrees Paris. Well, which path are we going to go? Depends on you folks. A little bit on me too for a few years. But 2100 is not the worst. That's sort of still manageable. The problem comes afterwards if we don't behave. Then it really goes through the roof by the year 2315 feet. Now, tip the next slowly. It says here, local sea level rise can differ substantially from the global. This is the global mean sea level. In many cases, the local sea level rise is substantially higher than the global average. And lo and behold, next. And we go to New York City. Here's the sea level rise curve made by the New York City Panel on Climate Change, NPCC, and now it goes to IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. That was charged originally in the year 2008 by then Mayor Bloomberg. I was serving on that animal for 11 years. So these are the forecasts. Again, there are different pathways here, options. And what does that mean? 10%, 50, 90%. It means out of all those possible forecasts that not only have different population developments and energy transition scenarios, but also scientific uncertainties. Out of, let's say, 100 forecasts that you get from all those different options, 90% will be at this red curve or below. But then there's still 10%, meaning out of those 100, there are still 10 that are above that red curve. So it's not by no means the ultimate, but it's a safe approach to take the 90% out. And correspondingly, you get these other curves by only 10% fitting this curve, and the 10% is below, but 90% is above. Now you might say 90%, which is what the NPCC recommended for using as a planning curve for New York City and New York State later on adopted that too. And you'd say that's pretty high, why not taking the average? And I always use an example. If you take a flight from LaGuardia or JFK to San Francisco, and the airline tells you you have a 90% chance to arrive safely, but you have a 10% chance to fall out of the sky, you run to another airline. So why do cities should do less safe than you when you want to arrive at your target? So it sounds high, but given the risk that's involved, it's actually not very high. And there's another interesting thing. You see, let's see, you take the 90% out, and then it only turns out this one really happens. In the future, this thing will reach eventually where you plan for the 90% of it. So you actually bought yourself some time and extra safety in the meanwhile. So it's not a bad investment. It's not a misinvestment if you go for the higher safety. Next one. Oh, before you do, there's another curve out there. The NPC, a couple of years later, felt obliged to add another scenario that's even more outrageous, that goes to almost 10 feet by the year 2100 sea level rise. And they called it RM. RM stands for Arctic Rapid Ice Melt Scenario. If there's some theoretical and model studies have shown the Arctic ice cap would collapse much faster because we don't yet fully understand the science behind it, and we don't have sufficient data to really constrain any models, then that's something we at least should keep in mind that it could happen. That doesn't mean we have to plan for it, but we have to ask ourselves, what if? How quickly can we respond in case this should happen? So if you're lucky, we do only this. More likely it's somewhere here, but you cannot exclude this. They didn't assign a probability, but they just put it out to say, hey, watch out, folks. Okay, next. Now here comes another complicated graph, so stay with me for a moment. It's again from 1990 to a little bit more than the turn of the century, the next turn of the century, 2100. And we have four curves here, a red, green, purple, and blue one. Now what are those? These are the storm surge elevations from a 10-year storm, a 100-year storm, a 500-year storm, a 7-year storm in the year 2000. Sandy was nominally by its storm surge height 10, 11 feet or so. A 700-year storm that should on average recur only 700 years, given looking backwards in time, not forwards. Okay, so let's see. Here is a subway entrance that was flooded by Sandy down in the city. Now we go in and out of that subway for the next couple of decades until roughly the year 2090. We still go in and out of that same subway entrance. And lo and behold, it says this thing now floods every 10 years. Why? Because all these storm surges get uplifted by sea level rise. Sea rises and the storm surges will be just on top of it. If you divide 700 by 10, that's a 70-fold increase of the hazard and to some degree a similar multiplier for the risk, meaning the losses. It will be more frequent, so the annual losses, if you average them out, are in the order of 70 or so times larger in that year. Unless we do something, namely that's called adaptation. So that's the challenge. We have to look at the storm surge together with sea level rise. Otherwise, you literally miss the boat. Next one. Here are 3 maps in blue that show where the daily mean high water. Now, what is mean high water? Mean high water means we have tides here on the Hudson in this area. It's 3 to 5 feet. Every day going up and down. And we have 2 high tides, roughly 12 hours apart, every day. If you take the highest points of those 2 tides, average them out, and then average that out over a couple of decades, that's called mean high water. So this map therefore shows where with 3-foot sea level, you have the tides showing up in these darker areas. It's a little bit too contrasting here. Here, Queens, and here, Palisades, and so on. These blue areas, the tides will on average show up 1 to 2 times a day. 6 feet, you see, we march now inward. With 10 feet, that's sort of the RM scenario that the NPCC added in 2019. That's what it looks like. If you compare that with Sandy, it looks almost the same. So once or twice a day, you get flooded like we got flooded with Sandy. Good luck. It may come on a sunny day without the wind of Sandy. So it's still water flooding, not wave action flooding. But still, it's water, and that has a funny property. It knows how to get into your basement and wherever else. Next one. Here's Sandy. In terms of atmospheric pressure disturbance, it was one of the largest storm systems that North America has experienced. It wasn't the highest hurricane intensity, category 2 when it made landfall in this area. But its dimension was huge, which means it took a lot of waves and water from the ocean. And in the northern hemisphere, storms, low pressure systems with a storm around it rotate counterclockwise. In the southern hemisphere, for various reasons, they rotate the other way around. So the wind goes to the right hand and it makes landfall, brings the ocean to the land and the waves. And the wind blows and therefore the flooding is less on the left side of the land. There is still flooding on the left side too, because it's a low pressure system. And under atmospheric low pressure, the ocean just lifts up, and on high pressure, it pushes down the ocean. So there's still a bulge here, but it's a very asymmetrical bulge. It's lower on the left than on the right. So if you have a house on the right side of a storm approaching, quickly pack it up and bring it over to the left. Next one. That's how it looked in the hours before Sandy made landfall. A few of the coastal areas down here in New York City and New Jersey. There are no good pictures for the actual landfall because it hit at 9, 10 o'clock at night on October 29th, 2012. Many people followed the evacuation advice, but some didn't, and when the emergency service wanted to get to them, they had only mixed success. Tens of thousands of cars were left behind and blood destroyed. Next. Now, some colleagues of mine and engineering students got together around starting 2008, 2010, and published a paper in 2011, which was part of a New York State commission study. And I was in charge of the transportation system evaluation for all of New York State, including New York City. And so we made a study. What would happen if a 100-year storm would hit New York City in an optimal path, so the right hand is right hitting New York City into the face? And we tried to convince the MTA to give us the data for the subway system. We didn't want to have any of that for two reasons. If they know what happens, then they have to do something about it. And the other thing is, this was still 9/11, post-11 time. But you don't give any data about your system to people that are in academia that you can't trust. Well, we knew our way around because we needed the three-dimensional configuration of the tunnels. So we sent students with barometers into the subway, and they measured the pressure in the tunnels and the pressure's height dependent. So they took the subway system with their barometers and wrote down all the barometric measurements. We had one at the surface to correct for the air pressure from the atmosphere change. And we delivered a preliminary product to the MT and said, hey, you have a problem here. It looks like some of your tunnels may very well flood during a 100-year storm if it just hits here right. And we made that presentation, and the engineers all nodded. The administrators shook their head. But we had one person in the MTA, and it only needs one, that saw the benefit of it. And he gave us all the data of the three-dimensional configuration of the tunnel system. And of course, then he wanted us to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Now tell this to the Columbia lawyers that they have to decide a non-disclosure agreement when they are students sitting from China and working on that stuff. So that colleague of mine, he said, we are not telling Columbia about that. You and me, the professors, sign that privately. Then the NTA can sue us. It's not worth to sue us. It's very well worth suing Columbia for its endowment. So we just did it quietly and trusted those students. So what you see here is a piece of Lower Manhattan. That's Brooklyn, that's the East River, that's the Hudson River. And all those lines are tunnels of the subway system. And when they are solid blue, the 100-year storm floods them to the ceiling. And if they are dotted, then at least the platform was flooded. We gave that to the NTA in the year 2011, and then a storm Ida, no, Irene, some storm came along. And I said, oh my God, is that it? It turns out, no, it was 1 foot below some oil storm. So there was some water in the subway system, but not much. And a year later, there was this forecast of this gigantic storm building up in the Atlantic. And then they looked at each other again, and then they pulled out this map and said, oops, we have problems here. Then they did something very smart, which we in our study did not consider. They took their personnel and sent it into all the blue tunnels and ripped out all the electrical control and signal systems so the salt water from the storm wouldn't get into it. If that would be the case, if you destroy those control and signal systems, the subway system would have been shut down for 4 to 6 weeks or longer. The smart move, removing those control systems, allowed them to pump out the water, which took 1 week, bring those things back, reinstall them, cross their finger, and lo and behold, after 1 week, the subway system was running again. Now the difference between a 1 week shutdown of the subway system and 4 or 6 weeks, if you multiply that with a good fraction of the economic output of New York City, which is $4 billion a day, that saved the New York City economy and the MTA tens of billions of dollars. So it was sheer luck that a year before Sandy, we had given them this map. Of course, the media got all berserk. They called us all sorts of names, Cassandra of the subway system, whatever. But you can see, you don't necessarily always have to build concrete and steel barriers. Even some smart operational pre-event preparation can reduce the consequences tremendously. And that's important. Next. Another consequence was, of course, there was a transformer here, I believe on 23rd Street, Con Edison, that blew up, that put this whole part of Lower Midtown and Lower Manhattan into the dark, except the World Trade Center area here. It was called SOPO, the dark area. That stands for South of Power Outage, not the South of Western Street. It was 42nd Street, roughly. It was nice because people couldn't pump out their basements, or couldn't put any electric heaters and dehumidifiers in, So this lasted for a whole week. One of those things that Con Edison could have done better with some foresight. Next. A little bit closer to home. Down in Piedmont, that's River Road. This is Cornetta's here, for those who know it. Well, look, there was a little bit of an assembly of unwanted boats here. And of course, it wasn't just the boats. They slammed into some houses and did considerable damage. Not only were there boats, there were trees, telephone posts, and all sorts of things that did a lot of damage to many of the houses on the waterfront. Next. The total damage, by the way, for Piedmont, which is a village of 2,900 residents, was $20 million. That's, if you divide that, they're all people, including babies and grown-ups. That's $7,000 per head. That's quite a bomb. Piedmont is undertaking right now a comprehensive plan. It took me only 10 years to convince them that they're all this. And it's still pulling teeth, because comprehensive plan is supposed to have a short, midterm, and long-term vision, and a tool in terms of land use, so you don't build new things in flood zones or future flood zones. So all they worry about on that comprehensive planning commission is, do we have enough parking to get the people to the restaurants? So it's really a very frustrating experience right now to try to instill some forward-looking attention. Okay. And it just shows how selfish we are. We are not thinking about our children or our children's children. I call it intergenerational injustice. Okay? We just want to help ourselves and minimize our flood situation. Anyhow, here in this red color, or on that screen it's almost brown, this is the 100-year flood zone as we defined post-10. Before it was a little bit less. My house is here. So I see smack in the flood zone. People always say, you are the expert, you shouldn't. I said, no. The only way I can be an expert is if I live and experience the flooding. Costs you sometimes a little. But that's the current map. Now, you see there's also some flooding here along the river and along Sparkill, because the Sparkill is tidal up to the Rockland Bridge, which is here. No, here is the Rockland Bridge. Okay. That stone bridge. When you come down Rockland Road, for instance, from Palisades, you hit that area near the silk mill.
Near the what?
The so-called silk mill. This on Ferdinand. Well, it's actually in Piedmont. But anyhow, so that's the current flood map. But then the people up there in the hills weren't worried when we had the Sandy and these coastal storms which were building. They're up on the hill. What do they have to worry? Well, until Ida came in 2021. It poured a lot of rain on Tweed Boulevard that flowed down to 9W, and from 9W flowed down into their backyard and their houses, and mud came down, and suddenly they are very interested in climate change. Interesting what losses can do to. Now that's the current situation. So this is a 500-year flood zone in FEMA terminology. It has flooded several times in the last few years, so it's not once every 500 years. That's a really, I have terrible struggles with FEMA to really get their science and climate science better, to make better flood maps. But that's what it is. And you have to buy, of course, flood insurance if you have a mortgage. You see, the National Flood Insurance Program is not a program to protect the owners of the residences. It's to protect the banks so you don't default in your mortgage. They were the ones that pushed for the National Flood Insurance, the banks, when the private sector banks moved out in the 60s. And then the developers and the banks pushed Congress to have a National Flood Insurance Program, which is a real hoax because those maps don't reflect the real risk. And that's why the National Flood Insurance Program is more than $20 billion in the red and rising. Rapidly rising. Okay, that's the present or past. If you go on the widow's walk of my roof in Piermont, then I look down and that's Paradise Avenue. A little bit of a wet paradise. That's the Sparkler Creek, and you hardly can see the difference between the two. That's the scene that when I moved there in 2001, 2002, occurred maybe once or twice a year. Now, you have that scene in the order of 10 times a year. Some years it was 20. So there's already a tenfold increase just from this little bit of sea level rise that can make the difference between a street flood or not flood. It doesn't take much to make that difference. Next. That's my car, or was my car. Why? I looked at the tide chart. I knew tomorrow at 8:30 I have to have my car moved. I went to bed, set the alarm at 7 o'clock. And it rang. I did this and had another wonderful 2 hours of sleep. Well, then I came out, my stool, that's what it was. It was interesting enough, a total loss because of the digital control system that our cars are in these days. Next. This is the map of the year 2080. Now you see that all this, including Pier Road and Ferry Road, goes out to the pier, good portions of the patch parking lot D, but even a portion of Main Street here, they flood twice a day during the high tides. In the year 2080, for this 90 percentile sea level rise. Not only that, all these wonderful condos here, this wonderful view and the wonderful Hudson are now in the 100-year flood zone. And more along River Road and so on. So currently, Piermont is the village in Rockland County with the highest percentage currently, with the highest percentage of properties in a flood zone, either 100 year or 500 years. Maybe almost 50%. This brings this way up, and also the value of those properties, so it will be very interesting to see. And that's why these maps need to be included in a comprehensive plan. So the decision makers have a basis to place their policies on. But it's pulling teeth, it's politically not very popular. I can tell you that much. Okay, next one. This was largely coastal flooding. Now we get also water from above, not just from below. This is a map of the rainfall in inches, depending on the color code, here up to almost 10 inches in red, for this post-tropical cyclone called Ida that made it towards Louisiana, landed as a hurricane category 4, did a lot of damage there, and as soon as the hurricane gets over land, it loses its nourishment, which is the warm ocean. And so it quickly decreased, but it still moved as a tropical storm system through the southeastern United States. And when it approached our coastal area here in New Jersey, New York, and given that counterclockwise rotation, it brought a lot of moisture from the ocean to land, which then when it rises in the air on land, in the Palisades and otherwise, just comes down and set new records. Here Ida is more than 7 inches total, and an hourly record 3 inches. That's in Central Park. It rained more strongly in portions of New Jersey and other parts of New York City. But you see that we really got heavily rained on with all sorts of consequences. Interestingly enough, there was a year before a storm, RV, okay, that should read probably, oh no, it was just a month earlier. Yeah, August, September, not even a month. That set a new record for rainfall in Central Park. So, and then Ida broke the record that just had been set. So when you break records of heavy rainfall, then you know something is going on. A single swallow doesn't make a summer, but a lot of swallows make summer. In this case, this thing is called climate change. Next. So, what was the impact? And I focus here, with one exception, only on the eastern United States, not the Gulf states here. There were fatalities, 13 in New York City. Most of them died in basement problems in Queens. Very interesting little footnote if we have time to discuss that. There were in the order of $16 to $24 billion damage in the tri-state area, compared to twice as much from Sandy. So even rainstorms can do substantial damage. Transportation, if you don't go through all the things, how it was all affected. But I want to point out here the cars, and that's now for all of the United States. decades from just this one storm. 200,000 cars. If you just multiply that 5K, and many are 20 and 30K or more, that gives you $1 billion right there. So our private transportation infrastructure is highly vulnerable unless we are very careful. Housing stock in New York City alone, more than 1,000 buildings were substantially flooded. Of the 1,500 public schools, 234 flooded, which was just when the school had started. And when you have mold in a building, you don't want to bring your kids in. So that was a real severe problem for the education system, COVID. So Queens, 11 deaths, next one. That's what it looks like in the Queens neighborhood a few days afterwards. People just got rid of all this so-called stuff. It ain't nice. I can tell you from my own experience. I had 2.5 feet of water in my living room. And I can tell you later on in my story about that water that happened. It wasn't my plan. Next one. But water is not the only thing. And if you think that all the fires, this is from the year 21, in the West, and we have a lot of them down in Southern California right now, that's their problem. Well, look, all that soot that comes our way makes wonderful sunsets. But if you have asthma, you better stay indoors and wear a mask. Because all this stuff goes, of course, very effectively up in the atmosphere and lifts over the entire continent. Next. So what do we do about it? What's the time? I think I'm a little bit slow.
It's 11 after.
Pardon?
It's 11 after.
Oh, I better speed up. Climate change will speed up. So, this is what New York City decided to do after Sandy. It's the so-called Big U that wraps around as a levee and barrier system, dike system around Lower Manhattan. It hides behind park landscapes. Highly controversial here. But there was one area that didn't have financing. It was the financial district. Everything else, the state, either in New York City or the city, got federal monies to do that stuff. Well, that didn't sit very well with de Blasio. Next one. Next. And so he proposed he would put a new island in front of that area, raise that, and build a new island with Phil, and then have the private sector putting all these high-rise buildings for $2 billion on it. And that was essentially paid back the investment in the city. Well, boy, it didn't sit very well, not just with me, but with a lot of people. And finally, he got talked out of it. And Adams hasn't pursued this any further either. But if we walk up here to the Midtown on the east side, this is the East River here, and look from the Midtown East River across the East River to Williamsburg, this is what you see there. The blue ones are already finished and occupied. The red one was just proposed 2 years ago. It hasn't yet started construction. It's still building on the waterfront. We haven't learned our lessons. And, you know, there are a lot of smart people around New York City. But the real estate sector is trying to make a big buck over the next couple of decades. And who worries what in the year 2080 or 2100 happens to those buildings? And the people have to swim to and from their buildings, or they have to have an amphibious car, or the taxis have to be amphibian, and the garbage has to be picked up by barges. That's our future. And it hasn't quite sunk in, whether that's in Pirma or, yes, in New York City. Next. I picked this up this morning. I couldn't resist to include this image in that talk. Friends of mine that run an organization called Rebuild by Design did a study about all the 1 to 3 family home transactions in New York City. And they are mapping them here with those red dots, and the blue are the flood zones by the year 2050. $3.6 billion of assets were changed hands last year that are in these flood zones. In 2050, that's a little bit before their mortgage becomes due, if they are lucky enough to get a 30-year mortgage, because the banks know that thing too, and they're getting ever more reluctant to give you a mortgage if your house is assets, it's in flood zones. Next one. That's by Borough. This is an interesting one. Manhattan had only 31, but look what the average sales price per unit is. $6 million compared to $500,000 or so in the others. Very interesting. So in Brooklyn has the most, 1.4 billion, and comes Queen, 1.1 billion, and the other. But even, Manhattan has $200 million that changed hand just last year in flood zone. Next one. So people said, what can we do? And some smart people said, oh, we built barriers here, 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 and here, just like the Dutch have done, and keep just the water out. We don't have to do in here anything, right? Or still have to pump out the rain, but, at least we get rid of the coastal flooding. And then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, with the help of some private citizen group, came even with a smarter plan. They said, oh, no, we don't do it here, here, and here. We do it one here, from Red Hook, Sandy Hook to Coney Island. And another one here where the Whitestone goes through. That takes care of it. Great solution. Infrastructure behind it, everything will be unaffected by coastal storms. Great plan, right?
No.
Why not?
It's a sea level.
Why? Sea level. Wow. You should be the mayor of New York City. Why? Because we have a thing called the Hudson and another one called the Raritan River. And if you build those levees as high as you want to keep any sea level rise out in the future and coastal storm surges out there, those river wants to get out to the ocean so you get flooded from behind. Oh, what a misery. But U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they came up with this plan. It was not allowed to talk about sea level rise. They had a directive. Guess who? I won't mention his name. The then president. Anyhow, So you still can keep all the storm surges out, regardless of sea level rise, if you make those barriers high enough. But you can close them only for a few hours or during the coastal storm cycle. So the river can't pile up behind. So they're still surfing coastal flooding, but they don't do what I showed you before. You know, those twice a day flooding and doing mean high water and tides. That is not solved by those barriers. And so often people send delegations to the Netherlands and say, we want to learn from you how to deal with those issues. Now, they built their barrier systems and nobody talked about sea level rise. They have the same problem. Some interesting attempts to deal with it, can't go into it. So, it's a delay tactic for the next few decades, but it's not a sustainable solution. They cost $60 to $120 billion, these barriers. Maybe you can use some of that money to buy out people and move them to higher ground. So these are currently things that are being discussed in New York City, in Albany, in DC, and in the neighborhoods. If they built those barriers here in the Hudson, in Piedmont, we will be beneficiary during coastal storm surge. All the way up beyond Albany to the federal dam near Troy. The Hudson River is tidal all the way up. So this is a real difficult public decision-making process that's going on, has been going on for years now, and it's stalling because now they have directive by our congressional delegates wrote that in some funding legislation that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has to take into consideration. Next one. So we have three options. Protections, we just talked about that, barriers, rivers, big deal. The next one is accommodation. I haven't talked much about it. Raising your house on stilts, which is not sustainable because you can't get to and from the building in the long run. It's good for a few decades. Only sustainable adaptation mode is strategic relocation, managed retreat to higher ground. And politicians, any owners, including myself, are very reluctant to touch them. They have good reasons. You don't get re-elected if you destroy a neighborhood and say, get out of here. Unless we have a housing plan that we provide attractive housing before they are told to leave. And we have already a housing shortage right now without that. This is trillions and trillions of dollars. In the order of trillions of dollars in New York City and tens of trillions of dollars across the nation. And that has to get sunk into the public awareness, nor into our financial system. Next. Now, what have we done? Here is Manhattan, higher in brown, lower in green, really low in dark green. This is the census tract comparing 2010 to 2000. The red areas, we have thinned out the population. It got too expensive, people moved to Palisades or to Piedmont or to Suffolk. And then people that have more money have more demand on square footage. So we have thinned out population in the red. We have put more people into the blue areas. all into the low areas and the high areas within the land. We have the wrong policies. But we have no policies to counter this real estate market-driven development. There are places in New York City at high elevations with no housing on it. They happen to be graveyards. So sometimes I say we have to switch the dead and the living. Putting new areas up here and then make those areas into graveyards. It's a little bit sarcastic, but they're privately owned. I wouldn't be surprised in years to come if someone gets hold of pieces of those cemeteries. Next, hopefully. So the subway system floods. Here is a ventilation shaft or grate on a sidewalk, and it just flows in and the street floods. There are interesting solutions. That's on 4th Avenue in Brooklyn, where they put this raised elevation thing over a subway ventilation grate and then made a bike stand out of it. That prevents some street flooding as long as the water stays below that height here, which is very often. So the frequent street flooding. This is an ingenious device being shown off here by the NTA president. These buckets here are built into the ventilation grates in the sidewalks. And the first few gallons of water fill the bucket and flip over this thing and it closes itself. So you don't have to send people to close gates like this here, which is an entrance to Brooklyn Butter. It's not something like the subway is similar. Gates.
Sorry, we can't hear. I'm sorry. It's hard to hear.
Okay. So these are, you need people to operate them. But there are 4,000 of those devices in the city. That's a lot of people that they have to send in. And you have to do that in time before the storm makes landfall. And then the people can't come from the outer boroughs that work for the MTA because maybe the Metro North doesn't run anymore. So it's a real problem. It's not just hardware. You need an operational plan to do those. Next, so we can finish. That's Piermont's solution to climate change adaptation. I look at this house every day as a big struggle. This is not a hunting blind. This is a house where people intend to live at least over the weekends. This property is the most flooded property in Piermont. But they got hold of it because the people that owned it rightfully wanted to get rid of it. Snatched it up, and then came with a plan to build a house there. And when the village heard about it, there was a little bit of rumor that's crazy. And so an offer was made to them to be bought out. They declined the offer, went ahead, and the planning board really made sure that it's high enough. This is actually the new flood zone plus 2 feet extra for sea level rise as recommended by state guidelines. So all the buildings in the future, Piermont will change a little bit. And it's unsustainable because their car still gets flooded, you still can't get in and out when they want. And good luck if someone has a heart attack during a sand. because it makes demands on the emergency services. So it's not smart. Sorry to say this, my future neighbors. Okay, I think it's time to wrap up. Both mitigation and adaptation are equally urgent, because if we don't mitigate, then we have to adapt more later on. So, most of the other consequences. Mitigation tends to be top down in the process from international wide because we share the atmosphere. So we have all to work together with the Chinese, believe it or not, or Russians and Indians and Brazilians and Europeans, to really bring this energy transition about as quickly as possible. Adaptation works best from the bottom up. Why? Because the local conditions tell you what to do or not to do. You can't make an agreement with Chinese not to build along the spot country. Both mitigation and adaptation, huge major financing, in the trillions of dollars, not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector. Can influence some of those things in tax policies, like municipal bonds, cheap rates, and so on. Anyhow, the equity issue globally, but also locally, is a big issue. Think of the atoll islands in the Pacific. They practically not contribute to the climate change. They are the first one that have to leave, and already some had to leave. Many bought Marshall Islands for land in the Fiji Islands, which are higher volcanic islands. The Fijians were so happy about all these folks coming from the Marshall Islands. So it needs really civic engagement, including voting for the right people, help find local champions, and develop a vision not just for the next few years, but see how the short-term measures that we can take to protect ourselves now either help or hinder future generations. So they should be integrated with each other. So many of the currently implemented conservancy measures are only temporary fixes like the Fremont House, and de facto only delay sustainable solutions, such as retreat to higher ground. And with that, next. There was a guy, he knew what managed retreat means. He was very smart. He had very good climate advisor. He was even very ecological about it. And sometimes I show that, yes, in church communities. Because some might not want to go with the scientific arguments, but maybe they listen to this guy more. You don't want to do those. Timing can be crucial. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your experience, your wisdom, and your insights. We have just a few minutes, I think, for Q&A. So can we, anyone? Question for Dr. Green? Yeah. Check. Check.
So I'm so impressed with the maps. You have this Piermont comprehensive map for, what is it?
2080.
For 2080. And all over Rockland County, I know you live in Piermont, but all over Rockland County, there's tons of development along the Hudson River for housing in Haverstraw and Stony Point and just about everywhere, and no matter how many times we go to town boards to talk about this, they're not really interested. Have you been approached to be making these kinds of maps for these other towns so that the county can look at this?
Look, Columbia University has a website that maps out any sea level rise for any time horizon in the entire Hudson Valley. It's on the website. You also can go to, what is it, Princeton Climate Climate Central, it's called, another organization. To their website, they have a similar things for the whole world. Columbia thing is a much higher resolution because it focuses only on the Hudson Valley.
The other part of that is about the whole transportation thing that you discussed, and railroads, like all of the railroad issues with mudslides.
Metro North already floods during high tides and during coastal storm surges. The freight that goes along the Hudson River down near Bear Mountain, what's the island? What? Iona, thank you. You know, it's practically at zero, the railroad tracks. They will have to invest a lot of money to make those freight trains that run through Tappan every day, being able to come up and down. So, I mean, this was only touching the surface. Yeah.
Yes, it seems from everything you presented that the ultimate plan is to move more people to smaller, higher ground.
Yes.
And so there's going to be this big crunch to move more and more people, to move bigger and bigger families to higher and higher ground, which means more infrastructure up in the higher ground, and less for anybody who's unlucky enough to be left in lower ground. So is that really it? That's it?
Well, I made one proposal to Piermont to approach the Palisades Interstate Park Commission and trade land. We move up on Tolman Park, and the Interstate Park Commission gets all the lowlands. I mean, we have a lot of high empty places here. Okay? But it's all, you have to get first into the right mindset and then explore legal, political, financial, ecological, all sorts of consequences. And that's a process that our political process is not very well equipped to do.
Klaus, what is the prospect for insurance? In other words, we look at our area here, of course, housing costs, housing prices have gone way up, but hazardous risk has gone up too. What are the prospects over the next short term, 10, 20 years for insurance?
If you live in California, just to give an example, two of the major insurance companies in the US, Hartford and one other, will not write any house insurance anymore in California because between the earthquakes and now the wildfires and once in a while flooding, the risk exposure is too high. The premiums would have to be so high that nobody can afford that insurance, and the insurance companies still make a profit. After all, they are private companies. That's why we actually have a national flood insurance, because the private insurers walked away from the flood insurance in the 60s. They said that's not insurable, this stuff. And that's why the national flood insurance is in the red, which the private sector can't afford to do. So this will be a great correction to the real estate market, not because of the prices falling, but the insurance rates will go up so high in some areas, whether wildfire places or in flooding areas, that people will say, oh no, I can't do this, I buy somewhere else, or live somewhere else and pay less, lower premiums. So I think to insure your house is only a very partial solution. I don't have a flood insurance, even so I sit in a flood zone. Luckily, I don't need any because I don't have a mortgage. Okay? But for those who have to get a mortgage, they need flood insurance. And so I think the insurance trends will push people to safer places because insurance will become practically unaffordable.
Okay, let's look at one more question maybe, and then, yes?
Well, I was just curious, you said that in the future, smaller storms coming up the Atlantic coast would be as dangerous as the larger ones. Is that because of sea level rise?
Yeah.
That's why.
Because you need a smaller, so this is the sea level rise and here's the place that floods. You need a big one now. And the sea level rise is here. You need only a small storm, but small storms occur more frequently.
Thank you so much once again.